Welcome to my PowerPoint presentation for the Wikipedia Edit-A-Thon training that I ran on November 6th, called Wikipedia, It's Not That Hard. My goal today is to show you some basic things to keep in mind when editing Wikipedia, things that will play into the Edit-A-Thons we are running over the next few months, including the November 13th one about Townie, Andre Dubus's memoir. Your first goal is to create an account. The reason I ask that everybody does this is because there are entries that are protected, and having a verified account will ensure that you're able to edit them. If you don't have an account, there might be pages you can't participate in the editing of. So make sure before you get started on the 13th that you have your account created. We will have a station that helps, but it's best to come in with one ready to go. The number one rule we want to keep in mind is the policy about verifiable sources. There are a number of core policies, from neutral language to no original research to the nature of Wikipedia being an encyclopedia. But the verifiability one is really the one you want to keep in mind as you're working. The key is the sources and where your sources are located. Now, the big rule that this connects with is the idea of no original research. What that means is that the research has not yet been published. This means there has to be some sort of source, be it a news article, a magazine article, preferably a scholarly source or book when it comes to the idea of original research being something that academics use. If it's something you're still writing that's pre-pub, that is controversial but not yet published, the idea is to keep it out. This plays into two key things that we want to think about. The idea of primary sources, which are useful but not always the perfect source. If you can find something additional that publishes an idea in a primary source, it's often better to use that or both of them than just the primary source. This includes anything that contains opinion pieces, blogs that somebody may have written themselves. In historical sense, it could be diaries, letters, things like that. The key is to see if we can get as many sources verifying that as we can. If we can't get any sources verifying this, if it's new, it might be something to keep out if it seems like it doesn't really fit. One thing that people really struggle with on the verifiable source issue is what counts as a verifiable source. You don't want to use anything that has an opinion stated in it. So while newspapers are useful, mostly the news articles in them rather than opinion pieces and editorials, simply because that's where factual data and editing tends to happen. The same goes for online sources. Blogs, even though they might come from news sources, tend to be focused on opinions rather than fact. Those are inadvisable to use. We also consider self-publishing sources something to avoid, only because there's no real editing process. This is a day and age where, between the internet and the self-publishing industry, things can get out there really easily without any fact-checking. And it's critical to keep a watchful eye on what the source is, what they're trying to promote, and who has been supporting them through publication. The effort of going to a publisher, getting an editor to work on something, even the peer review process for scholarly sources, it's much more useful than some academic who can't get things published, so goes for the self-publishing route. The ideal websites to use are those that come from news and magazines. Also historical societies, archives, libraries, sources that come from those as far as original research goes, and self-published sources. A lot of them put together primary source resources and digitize them, so they're useful. Scholarly sources, even though they aren't universally accessible outside of academia, they are still heavily used and encouraged. And in fact, you'll see on our Wikipedia Edit-A-Thon web pages links to databases that might be helpful for the current Edit-A-Thon we're doing. One of the key issues we're going to deal with is the idea of a biography of a living person, simply because I've added Andre Dubus III's entry to the list of entries we're going to look at. but he's still living, and he's talking a lot about what he thought of the book, how he decided to write this book, the evolution of this book. He's talked to our students about this. But the key is to sync back to that idea of what a verifiable source is. The biography of living people policy is really specific about what's allowed and what isn't allowed because of problems that Wikipedia has had in the past. Well, the most recent issue that's come up with this is Philip Roth, who wanted to make sure there were some edits and corrections in his one of his articles about a book he had written. There was content in the Wikipedia article that wasn't accurate, and he knew it wasn't accurate. It was about the origin idea for the novel, and he wanted to make sure it was correct. Now, the biography of living people policy is probably the most postmodern existential crisis-like policy in all of Wikipedia, and it is bizarre to deal with and difficult to deal with, and people see it, and when they see it in action, they think people are complaining about Wikipedia. But the reality is that they're trying to create a verifiable source that can be used. And I've linked here to Philip Roth's open letter that got posted online on a magazine source, and the policy on biography of living people, and those links will be included on the Edit-A-Thon webpage. The thing to keep in mind is that unless a source can be verified, it can't be added. So while it was true and Philip Roth was a source on the origin of his idea on writing a novel, him simply saying it could not be verified in some way. It has to create the citations that academics are so used to doing. What he needed to do was go and get it written down in print in a way that wasn't himself publishing. So had he written something in a blog that he runs or on his webpage, it would not have been considered verifiable source, an appropriate source. He had to get somebody else to support him by going to a magazine, even if it was an online only magazine, somebody who would print his words that could be considered trustworthy and thus verifiable. When it comes to using sources like Andre, we're going to have to look for similar things. Interviews he did to verify information, especially interviews that were done with magazines and newspapers. Videos are going to be a little trickier, and if we can find a video that talks about what he does, then we can deal with that when it comes up, and we'll discuss how to make sure it's properly used and cited. The final and most important part of doing this Edit-A-Thon is that we make sure that we include citations for every source we use, whether it be a web page or a book or a database article or something from our biography database. The key is to make sure that the citation is properly added to Wikipedia. It's not an APA or MLA or Chicago style citation. It's what they call metadata, and they identify the metadata that you want to use, and this will be added to our Wikipedia Edit-A-Thon page so that you can see examples. Now, I've put an example here from the Paul Revere Wikipedia entry. So you can see an example of a book citation. You can see that it's specifically coded with symbols that identify specific lines of metadata. You see what the ref is, the last name, the first name, the year, title, location, publisher. These are elements of a traditional book citation. They're just labeled and organized differently so that it could be properly added to the Wikipedia page. And Wikipedia will look at this, the coding on Wikipedia will look at this and see what it actually has to do. It already knows that based on what metadata is provided. Now, this is a book. If it was a journal article, it would get cite journal. If it was a video, it would be cite video, etc. So I'll make sure that all of those are there for you to access. These are the things we want to keep in mind when it comes to our Edit-A-Thon and editing Wikipedia. This is not difficult, it's just a little nuances. Keep in mind that first you want to create an account. When you find sources, you want to make sure that we can verify them, that they're not self-published sources like blogs or self-published books or articles that we randomly find posted on a website. We want to make sure that when we're dealing with primary sources that we try to find maybe another source to support it, or we find a way to include the primary source usefully. When it comes to a biography of a living person, we want to be very careful about what we use, making sure that when it is something about a person, we find it in a third-party resource. Again, this idea of self-publishing is something to avoid. So if it's in their personal blog, we keep it out. But if it's something they state in a reliable resource, then we can include it. And finally, we want to make sure we add citations to all of them. You'll see on a lot of our entries that adding a citation and adding more citations is the most important thing they want to accomplish on that entry. So if we can find citations to verify information, we've done a lot of work to improve the quality of the article. Thank you, and let me know if you have any questions.